February 19, 1945, 2:47 p.m. Inside a volcanic cave on the eastern slopes of Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima, Corporal Anthony Tony D'Amato pressed his body against jagged black rock as a Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun tore through the darkness 3 feet above his head. The muzzle flash illuminated 14 trapped Marines behind him, some bleeding, all terrified, none with a clear shot at the gun nest 20 meters deeper in the cave. Tony's M1 Garand rifle lay in pieces beside him, destroyed by shrapnel 30 seconds earlier. All he had left was his Ka bar knife and 23 years of cutting meat in his father's butcher shop on Milwaukee Avenue in Chicago. The Marines had exactly 4 minutes before Japanese reinforcements would arrive from connecting tunnels. 14 men were about to die in this hole. Before we continue with Tony's incredible story, we need your help to keep these forgotten heroes alive. If you're already hooked by what you're hearing, hit that like button right now. It tells YouTube to share this with more people who care about real history. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of courage and innovation from World War II. And here's something we love. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your country, your city. We have viewers from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Manila to Montreal. Are you a veteran? Did your grandfather serve? Do you have a connection to this war? We want to hear from you. Now back to that volcanic cave on Iwo Jima, where Tony D'Amato was about to do something that would make absolutely no sense to any rational soldier. Anthony Michael D'Amato grew up with a knife in his hand, not a weapon, a tool. Every morning since age 11, he'd arrived at D'Amato and Sons Quality Meats at 4:30 a.m. to help his father prepare for the day. By age 16, Tony could break down an entire side of beef in 17 minutes. By 20, customers specifically requested him because his cuts were so precise they lost almost no weight to waste. His hands were small for a man, delicate even, but they moved with mechanical certainty. Tony had surgeon hands, his younger brother Paulie would say decades later. He'd make one cut through a shoulder roast, and you'd swear he could see through the meat. Never hit bone, never tore muscle fiber, just perfect, clean cuts. Tony was 5'7" and 148 pounds when he enlisted in November 1943. The recruiter almost rejected him, too small, too slight, hands too soft for a Marine. But America needed bodies, and Tony D'Amato became one of them. He shipped out to San Diego for basic training in January 1944. Rifle marksmanship came easily. Hand-to-hand combat did not. Tony wasn't built for brawling. He compensated by being faster, smarter, and more precise than larger men. What nobody realized, what Tony himself didn't fully understand until that cave on Iwo Jima, was that precision can kill just as efficiently as power. Tony's unit, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, hit Blue Beach 2 on the southern tip of Iwo Jima at 9:02 a.m. on February 19, 1945. The volcanic sand was so soft that men sank to their ankles with every step. Within 20 minutes, Japanese artillery hidden in caves and concrete bunkers across the island opened fire. The beach became a slaughterhouse. Between February 19th and March 26, 1945, 821 Americans died on Iwo Jima. That's 223 men per day. One American died every 6.5 minutes for 36 days straight. The island was only 8 square miles, smaller than most American towns, but Japanese defenders had spent 8 months turning it into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. 1,500 caves, 600 bunkers, 11 miles of interconnected tunnels carved through solid volcanic rock. The Americans expected to capture Iwo Jima in 5 days. It took 5 weeks. Tony's best friend was Lance Corporal James Patrick Jimmy Morrison from Dorchester, Massachusetts. They'd met on the transport ship USS Missoula, heading to the Marshall Islands in April 1944. Jimmy was a plumber's son who talked constantly about the garage he'd open after the war. Morrison and D'Amato Auto Repair, 50-50 partnership, Jimmy handling engines while Tony managed the books. They shook hands on it the night before the Iwo landing. Jimmy Morrison died on the 4th day of the battle, February 22, 1945. 3:15 p.m. Jimmy was advancing toward a fortified bunker when a Japanese soldier hiding in a spider hole, a camouflaged individual fighting position dug into the ground, shot him through the stomach with an Arisaka Type 99 rifle. The bullet severed his inferior vena cava. He bled out in 4 minutes while Tony held pressure on the wound with both hands, screaming for a corpsman. Jimmy's last words were, "Tell my ma I wasn't scared." Tony lied to Mrs. Morrison in a letter 3 weeks later. He said Jimmy had been killed instantly, didn't suffer, went out like a hero. All of it was false. Jimmy had been terrified and in agony and very much aware he was dying. But Tony couldn't write that to a mother in Massachusetts. Something changed in Tony after Jimmy died. He volunteered for every dangerous assignment. He took point on patrols. He entered caves first. Other Marines thought he had a death wish. Maybe he did. Or maybe he was just tired of watching friends die while he survived. By the 5th day of the battle, the Marines had learned that the most dangerous places on Iwo Jima weren't the beaches or the open ground. They were the caves. Japanese defenders would retreat into tunnel systems during American artillery barrages, then emerge to counterattack. Clearing these caves required small squads of Marines to enter confined spaces, where rifles were often too long to maneuver effectively, and grenades risked collapsing tunnels on top of American troops. Between February 19th and February 24th, 47 Marines died in cave fighting. Same way every time, ambushed in darkness by enemies who knew every tunnel, every angle, every hiding spot. On February 26th, Tony's squad, 14 men led by Sergeant Daniel Cruz from El Paso, Texas, received orders to clear a cave system on the eastern approach to Mount Suribachi. Intelligence reported approximately 8 to 12 Japanese soldiers inside. The cave entrance was 3 feet high and 4 feet wide. The Marines would have to crawl. They entered at 2:35 p.m. The first chamber was empty. So was the second. The tunnel branched in 3 directions. Sergeant Cruz split the squad, 5 men down each tunnel, 4 held in reserve at the junction, including Tony. At 2:46 p.m., gunfire erupted from the rightmost tunnel. The Marines had walked into an ambush. A Japanese Type 92 heavy machine gun, 7 7mm rounds, 450 rounds per minute, opened fire from a fortified position at the far end of a 40-meter passage. The tunnel was so narrow that Marines couldn't spread out or find cover. 3 men went down in the first burst. The survivors scrambled backward, dragging their wounded. That's when the shrapnel grenade detonated. Type 97 fragmentation grenade, 4-second fuse. Thrown from a side passage the Marines hadn't spotted. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. Shrapnel shredded the lead Marine's legs and chest. He died instantly. More shrapnel struck Tony's M1 Garand, destroying the operating rod and cracking the stock. The rifle was unusable. 14 Marines were now trapped in a volcanic cave, with a machine gun covering the only exit, and Japanese reinforcements certainly en route through connecting tunnels. Sergeant Cruz tried to call for backup on the radio. Static. The cave walls were too thick. Tony lay flat against the tunnel floor, breathing volcanic dust that smelled like sulfur and copper. The temperature was over 100 degrees. Sweat ran down his spine. His hands were shaking, not from fear but from adrenaline so intense it felt like electricity in his blood. He looked at his destroyed rifle, then at his Ka bar knife, 7-inch blade, leather handle, issued to every Marine, standard combat knife. Everyone had one. Nobody thought about it much. Tony thought about beef, about pork shoulder, about the way muscle fibers separate when you cut perpendicular to the grain, about the exact angle needed to slice through fascia without dulling your blade, about knowing precisely where arteries run. He'd spent 12 years learning to kill efficiently. Just different targets. Tony crawled to Sergeant Cruz. The machine gun was still firing in controlled bursts, keeping the Marines pinned. "I can get to that gun," Tony said. Cruz stared at him. "With what, your knife?" "Yeah, that's suicide, D'Amato. 14 of us gonna die anyway if we sit here. Let me try." Cruz hesitated. He was 28 years old, 6 years older than Tony, responsible for 13 other lives. The mathematics of war are brutal. Sacrifice 1 to potentially save 14. "You got 3 minutes before they flank us from the side tunnels," Cruz said. "After that, we're all dead anyway." Tony nodded. He removed his helmet. It would scrape against the cave's ceiling. He removed his ammunition belt. Less weight, Quieter movement. He kept only the knife. "Covering fire on my signal," Tony said. At 2:52 p.m., 6 Marines opened fire down the tunnel, not aimed shots but suppression, forcing the Japanese machine gunners to keep their heads down. Tony crawled forward into darkness. The tunnel floor was uneven volcanic rock that tore through his uniform and cut his knees and elbows. He moved slowly, 6 inches forward. Pause, listen. 6 more inches. The machine gun was firing back now, bullets ricocheting off stone 3 feet above him. Rock fragments cut his face. He tasted blood and sulfur. 20 meters. In a straight line, that's 65 feet. At a crawl, in darkness, under fire, it might as well have been a mile. 10 meters in, Tony heard breathing. Not the machine gun crew, they were still ahead, firing. This was closer. A Japanese soldier in a side alcove, waiting to ambush anyone who advanced down the tunnel. Tony froze. His eyes had adjusted to the dark. He could see the faint outline of a man crouched in a natural depression in the cave wall, maybe 4 feet away. The soldier was holding a rifle, probably an Arisaka Type 38, bolt-action, 5-round internal magazine. If the soldier saw Tony, he'd fire. At 4 feet, even a terrible shot couldn't miss. Tony's training said to call for backup. Every instinct said to retreat, but retreat meant 14 dead Marines. Tony remembered his father's voice. The first cut is the most important. Hesitate, and the blade skips. Commit, and it goes exactly where you aim. He committed. Tony lunged forward. Not wild, not desperate, but with the same economical precision he'd used to separate a ribeye from surrounding fat. His left hand clamped over the soldier's mouth. His right hand drove the KA bar up and forward at a 30-degree angle, entering just above the clavicle and severing the right subclavian artery. The soldier went rigid, tried to pull away, but Tony held him. 7 seconds. The soldier stopped moving. Tony lowered the body silently to the cave floor. His hands were slick with blood. He wiped them on his trousers and kept crawling. 15 meters. The machine gun was louder now, a physical pressure against his eardrums. He could smell gun oil and cordite. He could see muzzle flash reflecting off the cave walls. 2 men manning the Type 92, 1 firing, 1 feeding ammunition. But there were more. Tony heard voices. Japanese, urgent, coordinating. He counted at least 3 more soldiers in the chamber with the machine gun. That made 5 total. 5 armed, trained soldiers. 1 Marine with a knife. Tony reached the edge of the chamber at 2:58 p.m. The machine gun was 8 feet away, positioned behind a natural rock formation that provided excellent cover from the tunnel, but left the gunners' backs exposed to the chamber. The Japanese hadn't anticipated anyone approaching from their side of the cave. 3 soldiers stood 10 feet behind the gun, reloading rifles and watching the connecting tunnel for American reinforcements. They were expecting counterattack from the tunnels, not from the direction of their own position. Tony had maybe 10 seconds before someone glanced his direction. He moved, not charging. That would be loud and obvious. He flowed. Same way he'd move behind the butcher counter when it was crowded, weaving between customers and other workers without bumping anyone. Economy of motion. The first soldier died the same way as the one in the tunnel. Hand over mouth, knife into subclavian artery. 7 seconds, lowered quietly. The second soldier turned at the sound. Barely audible, but enough. He saw Tony and opened his mouth to shout. Tony's blade went up through the soft tissue under the jaw, through the tongue into the hard palate. The soldier made a wet gurgling sound and collapsed. The third soldier swung his rifle toward Tony. At that range, 6 feet, even a desperate shot would probably hit. Tony threw his knife. He'd never thrown a knife in combat. He'd never thrown a knife at all except messing around behind the shop when he was 14. But the motion was the same as throwing a cleaver onto the cutting block. Spin, distance, impact point. The K-bar rotated once in the air and buried itself in the soldier's throat. The man dropped his rifle and clutched at the blade, making a high keening sound. Tony picked up the dropped rifle, Arisaka Type 38, worked the bolt to chamber around, and shot the machine gunner through the head. The second gunner spun toward him. Tony worked the bolt again, fired again. The gunner fell backward into the weapon. The entire sequence, From entering the chamber to the last shot took 40 seconds. Sergeant Cruz and the other Marines heard the shooting stop. They heard Tony shout, "Clear! Move up!" The squad advanced. They found Tony standing in the machine gun nest, covered in blood, most of it not his, holding a Japanese rifle with 1 round left in the magazine. 5 dead Japanese soldiers arranged in a rough circle around him. The body nearest Tony still had the K-bar in its throat. Corporal Eddie Martinez from San Antonio threw up. He'd been in combat for 8 months and had never seen anything like this. "Jesus Christ, D'Amato," Sergeant Cruz said. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Tony pulled his knife free, wiped it on a dead soldier's uniform, and sheathed it. "My dad's butcher shop," he said. "Milwaukee Avenue, Chicago, best cuts in the city." The Marines evacuated the cave at 3:15 p.m. 3 men had been killed in the initial ambush. 11 survived because Tony D'Amato crawled 20 meters through darkness and killed 5 enemy soldiers with a knife and stolen rifle. Word spread fast. By that evening, every man in 2nd Battalion knew the story. By the next morning, it had reached other units. By February 28th, Marines across Iwo Jima were talking about the butcher from Chicago who cleared a machine gun nest with a knife. Some details got exaggerated. One version had Tony killing 12 Japanese soldiers. Another had him fighting off an entire platoon. The truth was extraordinary enough. But something else happened. Marines started asking Tony for advice. "How do you move that quiet? How do you know where to cut? Can you teach me?" Tony was uncomfortable with the attention. He wasn't a hero. He was a kid from Chicago who'd gotten lucky and used the only skills he had. But he also recognized that other Marines were going to keep dying in caves if they didn't learn better ways to fight in confined spaces. So he started teaching. Nothing official. No formal classes or Marine Corps approval. Just small groups during downtime. 5 or 6 men at a time practicing movement, practicing knife work on coconuts and captured equipment, discussing anatomy and vulnerability points. "Forget what they taught you in basic about knife fighting," Tony would say. "That's for shows. In the dark, in a tunnel, you got one chance. You got to know exactly where to cut and commit completely. No hesitation. Hesitation gets you killed." He'd demonstrate on coconuts, showing the angle, the pressure, the follow-through. Some Marines thought it was ridiculous. Most paid attention. Between March 1 and March 10th, 17 Marines from units that had trained with Tony were involved in close-quarters cave fighting. 14 survived their encounters. Before Tony's informal lessons, the survival rate for hand-to-hand combat in caves had been less than 40%. Nobody kept official statistics. The Marine Corps didn't track lessons learned from Butcher, but the men knew. Word kept spreading. "If you're going into a cave, talk to D'Amato first." The Japanese noticed too. On March 4th, American intelligence intercepted and translated a Japanese radio message from Iwo Jima to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. The message reported, "American Marines employing new close combat techniques in tunnel fighting. Casualties among tunnel defenders increasing. Recommend immediate tactical adjustment." The Japanese started posting additional guards in their cave systems. They increased use of booby traps. They changed their defensive doctrine specifically to counter the threat of Americans who'd learned to fight like Tony D'Amato, one soldier, one butcher from Chicago. And the Imperial Japanese Army changed tactics. The Marine Corps never acknowledged it. There was no official directive, no training manual update, no commendation for developing new tactics. Tony D'Amato remained a corporal, same rank he'd held when he entered that cave on February 26th. But the men knew. By March 15th, an estimated 60 to 80 Marines across 3 battalions had received some form of knife fighting instruction from Tony or from other Marines he'd trained. The informal network kept growing. On March 18th, a squad from 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines cleared a heavily defended cave system near Hill 362A. They killed 9 Japanese soldiers in close combat with minimal American casualties. The squad leader later told his company commander, "We used the Chicago method." That's what they were calling it, the Chicago method. It was never written down. It was never officially adopted, but it saved lives. The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945. The Americans had predicted victory in 5 days. It took 36 days and cost 821 American lives. Another 217 Americans were wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died. Tony D'Amato survived. Barely. On March 22nd, during operations to clear the remaining Japanese-held caves in the island's northern sector, Tony's unit came under mortar fire. Shrapnel from a Type 97 mortar round struck Tony in the left shoulder, right thigh, and abdomen. He was evacuated to a hospital ship and then to a naval hospital in Guam. He spent 7 weeks recovering. The wounds healed, but he'd lost 15 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. When he looked in a mirror, he didn't recognize the face looking back, older, harder, someone else entirely. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over everywhere. Tony D'Amato shipped home on September 3, 1945, aboard the USS General M.C. Meigs. He weighed 127 pounds. His dress uniform hung loose on his frame. He carried his K-bar knife in his sea bag. He'd cleaned it hundreds of times, but never sharpened it. The blade still showed nicks from striking bone and volcanic rock. He never used it again. On September 19, 1945, exactly 7 months after crawling into that cave, Tony walked through the front door of D'Amato & Sons Quality Meats at 6:15 a.m. His father was already behind the counter, breaking down a side of pork. "You're late," his father said without looking up. "Sorry, Pop," Tony said. "We got 12 orders before noon. Get your apron." Tony got his apron. That was it. No parade, no ceremony, no long conversations about the war. Just work. Customers came in. Tony cut meat with the same precision he'd always had. Maybe better now, maybe steadier. Nobody mentioned Iwo Jima. He didn't talk about it. In November 1945, Tony received a letter from the Marine Corps. He'd been awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, behind only the Medal of Honor. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action against enemy Japanese forces during operations on Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands, 26 February 1945. It described the cave assault. It mentioned 5 enemy soldiers killed in close combat. It noted that his actions had directly saved 14 American lives. The Navy Cross came with a ceremony at the Great Lakes Naval Station north of Chicago. Tony's parents attended. So did his younger brother Paulie. So did Mrs. Morrison from Dorchester, Massachusetts, Jimmy's mother. She hugged Tony and thanked him for being her son's friend. Tony cried for the first time since the war ended. The ceremony lasted 20 minutes. An admiral pinned the medal to Tony's uniform. There were photographs. Then everyone went home. Tony put the Navy Cross in a drawer and went back to work. Anthony D'Amato never spoke publicly about Iwo Jima. When customers at the shop asked if he'd served, he'd say yes and change the subject. When his children asked about the war, he'd tell them it was a long time ago and not worth discussing. The Navy Cross stayed in the drawer. In 1947, Tony married Marie Castellano, a schoolteacher from the neighborhood. They had 4 children, 3 daughters and a son. Tony worked at the butcher shop until his father died in 1966, then took over the business. He ran D'Amato & Sons for another 23 years. In 1973, a military historian named Dr. Robert Chen from Northwestern University was researching close-quarters combat tactics in the Pacific Theater. He'd found references in unit logs and personal letters to something called the Chicago Method, an informal knife-fighting technique that had spread through Marine units on Iwo Jima in March 1945. Every trail led back to a corporal from 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines. Anthony M. D'Amato, Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Chen called the butcher shop. Tony answered, "Mr. D'Amato, my name is Robert Chen. I'm a historian researching the Battle of Iwo Jima, and I'd like to speak with you about—" "Not interested," Tony said, and hung up. Dr. Chen called back 6 more times. Tony hung up 6 more times. On the 7th call, Marie answered. "Doctor." Chen explained what he was researching and why it mattered. Marie covered the receiver and turned to Tony. He says Marines are still using techniques you taught them. He says it's part of history. Tony stared at the meat counter for a long moment. Then he took the phone. He met with Dr. Chen once in December 1973 at the butcher shop after closing. The interview lasted 90 minutes. Tony spoke carefully, precisely, the same way he moved a knife, economical, no wasted motion. He described the cave, the darkness, the machine gun, the 5 soldiers, the 40 seconds. "Did you think you were going to die?" Dr. Chen asked. "I thought 14 Marines were going to die if I didn't do something," Tony said. "Wasn't about me." "Do you know how many men survived because of what you taught them?" "No. The estimates range from 40 to 80 lives. Probably more." Tony was quiet for a while. "Jimmy Morrison should have lived," he finally said. "Kid from Massachusetts, was going to be a mechanic. Took one in the stomach on the 4th day, bled out in my arms. He should have made it home. I should have saved him." "You saved 14 others," Dr. Chen said. "Wasn't enough," Tony said. That was the only interview Tony ever gave. Dr. Chen published his findings in a 1975 academic paper, Informal Tactical Innovation in USMC Cave Fighting Operations, Iwo Jima, February-March 1945. The paper noted that close-quarters combat survival rates increased measurably in units where Marines had received training based on Anthony D'Amato's techniques. It concluded that battlefield innovation by individual Marines, disseminated through informal peer networks, constituted a significant and underappreciated factor in American tactical adaptation during the Pacific War. The paper appeared in the Journal of Military History. Circulation: approximately 200 academic subscribers. It was cited in 4 subsequent papers over the next decade. Tony D'Amato never read it. Nobody sent him a copy. Dr. Chen assumed the Marine Corps would. They didn't. Tony retired from the butcher shop in 1989 at age 67. His son had no interest in taking over the business. He was an accountant, worked downtown, made more money pushing papers than cutting meat. Tony sold D'Amato and Sons to a chain grocery that kept the name for 3 years before changing it to something generic. Tony and Marie moved to a small house in Arlington Heights, a suburb northwest of Chicago. They had 6 grandchildren. Tony taught them to play cards, took them to Cubs games, made them lasagna every Sunday. He never mentioned the war. On Veterans Day, 1994, a local reporter doing a story on World War II veterans in the suburbs found Tony's name in VA records and showed up at his house. Tony answered the door. "Mr. D'Amato, I understand you received the Navy Cross at Iwo Jima. I'd love to interview you for up." "Not interested," Tony said and closed the door. The reporter left a business card in the mailbox. Tony threw it away. Anthony Michael D'Amato died on August 15, 2003, 58 years to the day after Japan surrendered. He was 81 years old. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless. Marie was with him. So was his son, Anthony Jr. The obituary in the Chicago Tribune was 4 sentences long. Anthony M. D'Amato, 81, of Arlington Heights, died Friday. He was a U.S. Marine Corps veteran and retired butcher, survived by wife Marie, son Anthony Jr., daughters Teresa, Linda, and Angela, and 6 grandchildren. Services Monday at St. Edna Catholic Church. No mention of the Navy Cross, no mention of Iwo Jima, no mention of the 14 lives saved, or the 80 more who survived because he'd taught them how to fight in the dark. Just retired butcher. In 2008, the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Triangle, Virginia, opened a new exhibit on the Battle of Iwo Jima. One small display case featured personal items from Marines who'd fought there. Among the items, a K-bar knife donated anonymously by Marie D'Amato after Tony's death. The placard reads, "Knife carried by CPL Anthony M. D'Amato, 2nd BN, 28th Marines, 5th Marine Division, awarded Navy Cross for actions in cave fighting, 26th and February 1945. Approximately 400 Wagzewundarun people visit the museum each year. Most walk past the display in 30 seconds. But in 2011, a veteran noticed it. Gunnery Sergeant retired Marcus Webb, who'd served in Fallujah during the Iraq War. Webb spent 10 minutes staring at the knife, then found a museum curator. "Do you know what this is?" Webb asked. A World War II combat knife, the curator said. No, Webb said. This is the knife, the Chicago method. We're still teaching a version of it in MARSOC, Marine Special Operations Command. I didn't know where it came from. The curator looked confused. Who was D'Amato? Webb asked. The curator checked the museum's records. There wasn't much. Name, unit, medal citation. No additional context. Webb spent 6 months researching. He found Dr. Chen's 1975 paper. He tracked down 3 surviving Marines who'd fought on Iwo Jima and had learned knife fighting from Tony D'Amato. 2 of them were in their late 80s. 1 was 91. All 3 remembered Tony clearly. Small guy, one said. Quiet. But when he showed you how to move, how to cut, it made sense, like he could see something the rest of us couldn't. Webb wrote an article for the Marine Corps Gazette. The Butcher of Milwaukee Avenue, Informal Tactical Innovation and the Forgotten Legacy of CPL. Anthony D'Amato. The article appeared in the March 2012 issue. It was read by approximately 3,800 active duty and retired Marines. 400 of them wrote to the Gazette. All 400 said some version of the same thing. I didn't know where that came from. I've been using those techniques for years. In 2015, the Marine Corps quietly updated close-quarters combat training to formally incorporate principles that had been passed down informally for 70 years. Economy of motion in confined spaces, anatomical targeting for knife fighting, silent approach techniques in low-visibility environments. They didn't call it the Chicago method. They called it Room Clearing Enhancement Protocol, Annex D. But the men who teach it know where it came from. Marie D'Amato died in 2016 at age 92. She was buried next to Tony at Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery in Elwood, Illinois. The headstone reads, Anthony M. D'Amato, 1922-2003, CPL U.S. Marine Corps, World War II Navy Cross. There are 25,000 graves at Abraham Lincoln National Cemetery. Tony's is in Section 7, Row 14, Site 387. It looks exactly like every other headstone. On Veterans Day each year, someone, no one knows who, leaves a Ka bar knife at the base of Tony's headstone. It's always clean, always sharpened, always placed with the blade pointing away from the grave, handle toward the stone. By November 12th, the knife is always gone. Nobody knows who takes it or where it goes. But every year, without fail, it reappears on November 11th. If this story moved you, if you're glad someone remembered Anthony D'Amato and Jimmy Morrison and the 14 Marines who made it out of that cave, please hit the like button right now. These stories disappear if we don't share them. These men deserve better than 4-sentence obituaries. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story about the people who won the war, not with grand strategies, but with skill, courage, and a willingness to do what nobody else could do. And drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you served or if someone in your family did. Tell us if you've ever heard of the Chicago method. If you've ever been taught something that you didn't know came from a butcher shop on Milwaukee Avenue. These men didn't fight for glory. They fought for each other. The least we can do is remember their names. Thank you for keeping these heroes alive.